Well, it is time for part 2, or casting a TC821 tip bucket using translucent resin. This, of course, is a follow-up to a previous tutorial where I made this one-piece silicone mold using TC5110F. So if you didn't see that, definitely check that out. I will link that on the end screen. So this tutorial is all about making a translucent head tip bucket for my friend Danny, aka Janie Slash. I've molded Danny for a variety of projects over the years, and I had a copy of her head mold. So Danny asked if I could make a copy of her head into a tip bucket for her sideshow act. So I was happy to oblige, and I thought this would make for a great series on this channel. So here we are. Now, for this part of the tutorial, obviously check out the first part for seeing how we made the mold. But in this tutorial, I'm going to be casting up a translucent copy, so a hard plastic copy using translucent resin. And this, if you hadn't seen my tutorial where I made my vampire resin bust, that goes over this also in greater detail. So what I'm doing here is I'm getting the mold prepped for this. This is a one-piece silicone mold that was made in the previous tutorial. Of course, TC5110F, that's a fast-setting platinum silicone that is soft and stretchy and ideal for these kinds of molds where you need this to pull inside out like a sock. So I did that so I wouldn't have any seams to clean up, and just makes for a much faster, easier head mold, especially for this kind of project. Now, for the casting, I will be using TC821 translucent polyurethane resin. Now, the reason I'm using this resin is this cures translucent, so just adding a little bit of flesh pigment to this gives me a very natural look, much like we get with cured translucent silicone, only in this case, now we have a hard plastic that has the look of translucent silicone. So this is ideal for parts where we need a rigid part, but we still need the look of organic tissue. So what I'm doing here is just adding a very small amount of the flesh pigment to the B side of the 821. And of course, TC821 mixes 1:1 by volume. So what I've done here is I've just measured out a couple of ounces of the part B first, and I'm stirring that pigment in really well to that part B, and then I'll add the A. Now, this is a fairly fast-setting resin system, so always a good idea when you're going to be pigmenting it to mix your colors into the part B first, and that way you can get that color just right before you add the part A. Because remember, anytime you add the part A, that's when the clock starts ticking. So real important to get your color right, and then add your part A, mix that up, and then get ready to cast, because this is a fairly fast system. This is about a 2-minute working time at room temperature, and then about a 30 to 60 minute demold. And of course, that's going to depend on the cross section of the part. Now, I'm going to be casting this in several layers of resin. The first layer is just a very small batch that I'm going to slosh around, and also use a disposable brush to push that into some of the detailed areas. And I'm going to build this up in about 4 layers of resin. Probably could have done this in about 3 layers, but I was a little worried that I was going to make this too thin, so I went ahead and did 4 layers. But what I'm doing here is just sloshing this around and then using that disposable brush to push that into some of the more detailed areas like the ears and the nose, just to make sure I get a nice bubble-free part. And then I've got that empty mixing cup standing by so that I can flip this upside down and make sure that any of that drips out, that I can collect that in the bucket and recycle it if necessary. And you'll see that more in some of the subsequent coats. So again, our working time on this is about 2 minutes, and then about a 30 to 60 minute demold. And the way that works, the reason for that difference in the 30 to 60 minutes is when you're doing a really thin cross section, polyurethane resins are going to take longer to cure, whereas thicker sections will cure faster. So the complete inverse of an air drying system. Now, this is a slightly larger batch. Again, I'm adding my flesh pigment to my part B and then mixing that up first. And then, of course, adding my part A. So always a good idea to get your part B colored exactly the color that you want before adding your part A. And one of the things I'm going to do, because this is a translucent resin, much like silicone, we can layer this up in different colors and get a much more realistic organic look. So what I'm going to do for the final layer is I'm actually going to mix up kind of a vascular looking resin with red and blue dye rather than the flesh pigment to get that vascular look for the inside of the little tip bucket, but also so if any of that shows through, it just gives me a much more realistic look. So now, again, this is a larger batch, again with the same flesh pigment, and just sloshing that around. And this has a relatively high viscosity, but that actually lends itself really well to getting a really nice even surface coat when you slosh this around by hand. So I'm just going to move that around, make sure everything's coated really well, especially the ears. The ears are going to be the trickiest part. Make sure those get filled really well, and of course the nose. And then once I get everything filled, I just start tumbling that mold around by hand like this, just rotating it one direction and then sometimes flipping it upside down so it has a chance to run down into the neck area, and then rotating it again. And I just keep doing this, and I usually keep my smartphone nearby so I can keep an eye on the time, and that way I know when 2 minutes is up, I can stop sloshing that around and go and mix up another layer of resin. And because this is a fairly fast-setting resin, it doesn't take much time between layers. In fact, as soon as that gels to the point where it doesn't move, I'm ready to put the mold down and mix up another layer of resin. So here I am just parking that mold for a second on this bucket, and now I'm ready with another layer. And I didn't show the mixing process here, but exactly the same thing. A little bit larger batch of resin, TC821, again with flesh pigment. And just a little bit of flesh pigment. You don't want to add so much that you obscure that translucency, because that's kind of the whole point of this, is we want to get a nice realistic looking kind of skin look. And obviously this is a fairly macabre application here, but this process actually works really good for medical simulators and other applications where you're simulating the look of human skin, but you don't necessarily need a soft, flexible material like a translucent polyurethane like Skinflex or a translucent silicone system. So there I am just sloshing that around. And that's where that lip that I made on that mold in the first video really comes in handy, because that keeps that resin from dripping down between the silicone mold and the plaster bandage mother mold. Now, one thing I discovered after I made this head was that it didn't take near as much resin as I thought it would take to make a really strong hollow part. So in hindsight, I probably could have done this in just 2 layers. But here's my final layer, and this layer, of course, is mixed up with TC821, no flesh pigment. This time I just used a small amount of red and blue dye. That's the 7400 series dye, which is transparent. So that allows me to create a realistic kind of blood look. And then I slosh that around on the inside. Now, the reason I'm doing that really vascular color backing up that flesh tone is twofold. Is one, it allows it to look a lot more realistic by layering several layers of resin with flesh tone pigment and then that vascular color behind it. But then also, for this tip bucket to work as a tip bucket, ultimately I'll be using a Dremel tool to remove the top of the head, and that way the inside looks like a natural bloody inside of a head. So trying not to make it look too macabre. I was aiming more for kind of a stylized look with this rather than a gory prop, but I did want the inside to look like the actual inside of a head. So now ready to demold our head. This is about an hour after I did the last coat. And you see that flange is a little bit green from that last layer of resin, is still a little bit flexible, but overall this is a really nice hard plastic part. And you see we got a really nice look on that. And it looks much like we would have with a translucent silicone head, except in this case we now have a hard plastic head. So we get the benefits of the look of translucent silicone, but we get the cost benefit of casting this in resin. And of course, this being a tip bucket, I figured it would be a lot easier to carry around a resin head than a silicone head, because if we made this out of silicone, in this case, it would still require some kind of backing, so it's just going to be a lot heavier, and just silicone collects dust and things like that. So something like this, I wanted a more stylized look to the final piece. So there, I've cut off the top of the head with the Dremel tool, and now ready for a step of capping off the bottom, because again, this is going to be a tip bucket, so I can't just have that giant hole in the neck. So for that, I put the head on a silicone mold. I just flipped that mold upside down. On the back of it, this is a TC5140 silicone mold. Then I mixed up some more TC821, and I thickened that with Fiber Thick. And Fiber Thick is just an inert filler material that serves as a thickening agent for polyurethanes. You can also use that for a lot of the silicone systems as well, but Fiber Thick is just an inert fiber thickener, and you stir that into the resin and it creates a thick paste. And you can either create kind of a light paste with it, or in this case, I wanted this to be almost like frosting, so I added a lot to it and it just gave me a really nice thick paste that I could brush onto that the flat side of that mold, and then brush it up on the side so it would bond to the rest of the resin head, and that would cap off the bottom of the head. And that way it would look like it's sitting in a little pool of blood or gore or whatever, and also keep the tips from falling out the bottom of the bucket. So that's set up. Again, in about an hour I was able to demold that, and now that allows my head to sit on a level surface. And I don't care that that bottom is flat, because that's how it's going to be as a tip bucket, so that's perfect for it to just sit flat on a stage or table or whatever. And then I drilled a couple of holes on the sides of the head, and that's ultimately where I'll be putting a little steel handle through the top like a bucket. And then I used acrylic paints to finish out the head. And I'm really going for more of a stylized look here. I didn't want a super realistic head that's going to look too, again, I didn't want it to look too macabre, because this is a tip bucket that is supposed to invite tips. So I was going more for stylized severed head rather than hyper realistic severed head here. And one of the nice things about the TC821 is it comes out really dry and easy to paint. So it takes dry brushing really well. So I just did a few colors over the top, just around the eyes and the nose and the mouth, and did the ears and painted Danny's gauges a nice turquoise blue. And that was about it. I also just went ahead and painted on the eyebrows, and I am by no means a professional makeup artist, so this is what you get when you leave me alone with some acrylic paints and a severed head. Now, for the hair, what I did is I cut up a wig and I glued that onto some E6000 adhesive. And this is a pretty standard adhesive you can find at most hardware stores. And it worked fantastic for gluing that hair in place. And then I just used some little clamps to hold that in place while that dried. And then I used that same adhesive to stick some false eyelashes in place. Again, that worked fantastic for holding the hair and that cut down wig in place. And then I was feeling a little bit saucy with that adhesive, so I tried handling some hair with it. Probably not the best approach, but it worked good enough for what I was doing here. I knew I could hide whatever mistakes I did in handling that hair with some blood around the edge, and that's exactly what I wound up doing. Not my best work here, but this does work for this kind of application. So if you need to hand lay hair over a resin part like this, that E6000 adhesive will work for that. And I suppose with a little more practice, this was literally my first time to ever use that adhesive. So not horrible results for that. But here I'm just going around clipping the little extra hair off the top. And now I'm ready to put my handle in place, and then use some needle nose pliers to bend the edges of that up. And you see we have a nice little handy bucket of a head. I'm ready to close those little loops and secure everything in place. And our tip bucket is almost done. Now, one final finishing tip before we pass this on to Danny, aka Janie Slash. But this is also a good time to mention that all of the product links for this video, everything I used in this video, I'll be linking in the video description, so be sure to check that out. What I'm doing here is just adding some final touches of realism, some blood around the outside edge with some EVA drying blood. And now we have our finished head bucket ready to present to Danny. So again, big thanks to Danny, aka Janie Slash, And thanks to all of you for watching and supporting the channel. And hopefully this gave you all some new seasonal ideas for some fun things to do this Halloween. Stay tuned, I'll be posting some more Halloween content. But in the meantime, if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe, comment for the algorithm, and as always, thanks for watching and thanks for supporting the channel.